Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Stop Manual Testing, Take Your Weekends Back. I'm Mark Beebe, Marketing Campaign Manager for Worksoft, and your host for today's session. First, a couple of logistical points. We have a large number of people on the call today, so the lines will be muted. But we will take your questions toward the end of the 60-minute broadcast. Please use the question feature to submit questions at any time during the webinar. For questions we can't get to during the Q&A session, we will be sure to get back to you with an email reply. We will also make a link to the recording of this webinar available for registrants who are unable to make it, or perhaps for colleagues that you think might benefit from the material. Let me now introduce our speaker. We are privileged to have Chris Cross with us today. Chris is Worksoft's Director of Product Management for Certify and an expert in the field of test automation. Over the past 20 years, he has served in a wide variety of engineering and project management roles, including most recently for CA Technologies. Today, Chris is responsible for the strategic direction of Worksoft's flagship product and automated business process testing platform, Worksoft Certify. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well, everybody, I'm excited today to talk about one of my favorite topics. How do you take your weekends back? Or the official title, Stop Manual Testing, Take Your Weekends Back. One thing I've found working in the industry is that users, it doesn't matter if you're business analysts or QA people, you spend a lot of time testing and working the weekends because, you know, validating systems isn't your day job. So the focus of this webinar is to actually talk about how can we do that. So I am at Chris Cross3 on Twitter, so if you ever have any questions, want to get a hold of me, it's a great place to find me and discuss these cool topics. So I'm going to start out with a couple of questions. How are you spending your weekend? Please pick all that apply. One short straw drawn. Is it your time to spend the weekend working with IT and operations, testing systems to make sure they're up to date, you didn't break anything important, you know, those critical business processes? Or maybe too many hours on a Sunday weekend waiting to test again. There's nothing worse than actually going through user acceptance tests, finding a defect so you fail some tests, and then waiting for them to be fixed. You know, do you go home? Do you stay at the office? What do? You know, you kind of get in that quandary. Or the worst one, 3 a.m. Saturday alarm clock to check to see if the system's ready to test, either because something deployed poorly or because we found a defect on Saturday and need to come back and test on Sunday. In many cases, we do a lot of manual testing of the end-to-end processes, so we know we need to do those, so Monday isn't a disaster, but it's still 3 a.m. to check that out, right? So I can remember how this has really changed in the industry. I mean, in the old days, you would say, call the computer in, then you get your pager to go off, and now you could get a text page where people are like, well, you can just check your email, because they don't want to be the bad guy making you do this. But at the end of the day, business continuity is really important, so we know the reason we're working weekends is to actually make this happen. So, so if you think about how this works, you know, you can add your beverage of choice, but at the end of the day, we're still working the weekends. I mean, look at the lady on the left. She's got her hot tea ready, her phone staged, and, you know, it's about 3 in the morning and she's looking at the ocean saying, I wish I was there. Or some people are in the dark room drinking their caffeine of choice, getting ready to test. Sometimes on the weekends, you may need to have a little glass of wine because you're scheduling your life with the weekend time and working, or other times you need that sugar fixing your caffeine together to make it work. But at the end of the day, everybody in these pictures are getting ready for manual testing, which takes hours, literally lots of your hours to do the testing. The problem is manually validating data is just error prone. You know, we're doing this at weird times, we get tired, and manual testing a lot of times means you're doing the same thing over and over again. Let's face it, those repetitive tasks over and over again get pretty boring, right? And we lose fidelity of the details there. And what's most importantly, when I talk to a lot of my customers and friends and colleagues, this isn't their day job, right? When I talk to my QA people or business analysts look, it's my job to approve real orders to make money. It's not to actually validate the systems on the weekends. But I spend a lot of time practicing my job by basically working weekends and testing, right? So what's the point of this? What are we trying to accomplish by doing this on the weekends, right? You spend a lot of your time on weekends, you know, validating systems. Well, what does this mean? In reality, we have one common goal, right? We want to ensure we have flawless business process execution, so we come in on Monday and things work. We want to validate that it's either ERP upgrades or system maintenance that didn't break the system, because we know we upgrade databases and operating systems and message buses, but we don't really know the side effects of those things as unintended consequences until we actually do end-to-end validation. Other times, I've got some friends who are highly audited, like pharmaceutical industries, and they say, in reality, their weekend testing is really to make sure the system behavior is audited. So they've got compliance audits, they've got their Sarbanes-Oxley, their SOX audits. They need to make sure that they document the expected behavior of the system and prove they've validated it before moving to production. So you want to ensure that every business process works as planned for those things. At the end of it, it doesn't matter what your very specific rule is. It's basically you're supporting the business goals with better IT systems. You want to make sure that things are working well, your business is running as optimal as possible. So sometimes that means you upgrade software, sometimes systems. You make sure you've got all your ducks in a row for an audit later in the future. Right? So unfortunately, people spend their weekends validating systems. So it was interesting, when I talked to our users at Worksoft, we discussed this with people and figured out, what are you doing? How are you doing this? And with Worksoft, we obviously have a solution to help you do that. And the way we think about it is kind of 3 easy steps. One, we need to discover what actually should we test. What are those key business processes that we need to discover and then document, so we have those Sarbanes-Oxley things all wrapped up and bundled. Then we need to actually move towards automation. So instead of manually testing the same things over and over again, which gets a bit tedious, how can we actually automate the validation of the system? How can we teach the computer to do that? The third thing is, the key of getting your weekends back. How do we actually get the software to run this? So the idea is we actually need to run these automated tests on the weekends and actually give us some high-fidelity reports to understand what happened, so we can make those go, no-go decisions, or we can collect all the right documentation for our Sarbanes-Oxley audit itself. So in this webinar, I'm actually going to go through this 3-step process. What does it mean to discover, automate, and then run, so we can work on that goal of actually taking our weekends back instead of finding other things to do? Right? So what does discovery process mean? So when we mean discover at Worksoft, we really mean find the real end-to-end business process to test and document. One of the worst things you can do is spend a whole weekend testing, and it's actually the wrong process. It's because it's not a good representation. What do the end users do? So we have something called Worksoft Analyze, which allows us to actually observe how real users are actually using the system. So if you don't actually have a good feeling for how they're processing, say, orders in the US versus Asia versus South America, or they're actually handling fulfillments and warehouses and distribution management, we can actually figure that out through something called impact and actually business process mining. So we can tell you how people are doing things, and then we can have 2 great outputs of that. One is we can actually create automation, so you have a complementary certified test that actually can rerun those steps. The other is GenDoc. So how can we actually document the expected process? You can see on the right, you've got a screenshot and then the data that went in, and then it's an acceptance record. So you can say, we've observed you work, and this is how we've documented it. We've put screenshots, we've got all the data there, so we can sign off and agree when we have an audit and they ask, how do you handle a certain type of sales order or rush orders or things like that. We have that physically documented in a very graphical way. So that's one way to start thinking about getting time back itself, right? The other thing is, in many cases, people actually know what their business processes are. They understand that I'm upgrading a system, and so I may be something like, a CRM application, something new in a web application running in SAP. It could be something like classic SAP GUI on the right. But we've got our subject matter experts, like yourself, and you understand what the end-to-end process is. What you need to do is actually capture that process, whether you're going from web page to web page in different applications or into your SAP GUI and back to a web page in that. Actually capture that process, the things that you would do on this end-to-end validations, and then create a test asset out of it. So what we can actually do is we can use something called Capture, which quietly sits in the background, sits in the tray, and starts monitoring. And I can say begin capture, and I can take an end-to-end business process. Maybe I start with a mobile device, I go to the web browser, I go to SAP, I go to Hybris, Workday, Manhattan Associates, the mainframe, it doesn't matter. I cross all those things to create a representation of the end-to-end business process. That I'm trying to capture basically what I feel I need to validate to make sure the system's working correctly. So the nice thing is you're not seeing a bunch of scripting and programming languages here. So at Worksoft, we really feel that you should be able to focus on validating the system without having to write hundreds of lines of code. So you'll see all I did is a capturing steps on a web page. I'm not being presented with weird code in HTML. It's just kind of quietly happening in the background. So what this does is it allows us to hit a very large set of applications. So I'm sure you're sitting there saying, well, I started in SAP, but I go over to Maxima, or I go into Manhattan Associates, SuccessFactors. My business process spans a lot of different technologies. Well, kind of the secret sauce is we've taught our technology how to understand all those different applications. So you don't have to become a developer and spend weekends learning how HTML works and JavaScripting to actually write a test case. What you can do is actually just follow your normal job, say go into Salesforce, do your order, go into SAP, do your fulfillment, and as you go from technology to technology, we in the background know how to create a test case for that. So the nice thing is we've taught Certify how all these different applications work. The idea is you should be able to test something without having to be a heavy-duty developer. You don't have to know how to manipulate, JavaScript or VB script and things like that. And then we automatically generate the test cases. So this is kind of our secret sauce, the Object Action Framework. It's actually like the foundations of why Certify is here today. So what happens when you do that? So the nice thing is you can import these into Certify and we'll start generating processes. And then you start adding data. Because let's face it, automated testing is pretty much all about the data. Okay? And so I know this is a bit controversial. There's two schools of thought, the Hatfields and McCoys, on like how do you handle testing. Some people say a test should just be the actions and I want it to be data driven. So the idea is on this picture you can see I have a record set. So I'm going to run a sales order, but I'm going to run it with different combinations of data based on different sales organizations and materials to see what the different actions are. I want one master test and have it to be very data driven. In this case, the great things about SAP is we actually have certified data which can actually go look into your SAP instance and give you that right combinations of data. I mean, there's nothing worse than saying, hey, I've got a warehouse, I've got a customer, but the material isn't associated with those. So how do I actually test this? Well, what we do is we can actually go look into SAP and give you the valid data so you don't have those relationship problems there. So let's say the Hatfields. That's one way to do it. There's a bunch of other people who say, I want my automated test to look the same way as my manual test. So those are the McCoys. And they say, basically, I want each test to stand on its own to be a system of record or an automation of what the end user would do. So don't even give me this complex data-driven stuff. Make it look like the way the real users do it. And if they run 50 different combinations of data to test 50 different rules, let me have 50 different certified processes, which is fine. Just activate capture, run through those manual tests, and we'll give you 50 different tests. So it's kind of up to you to see culturing how that works for you. So you can keep it as straightforward as kind of a mapping as an automated test associated with a manual test, or get into being data-driven. But in reality, we know that with our big end-to-end business processes, and we validate those, it's all about the data, and that data moving between the systems, whether it's the order, to the materials management, to the shipping, to the billing. It's all about making sure the right data moves to the system. And that's kind of why we do all these end-to-end tests. We don't want data or orders getting stuck in the middle of the system itself. Of course, then there's the generate and how do we actually run it. Excuse me. So when I say run, I don't mean run by hand. Literally, how do we apply automation to do that? So if I've got a bunch of different systems out there I'm validating. Right here on my SAP system, I've got my expense system. So Concur may be something you're used to seeing. It's a nice web-based system. I've written a test process that goes through and starts adding all my data into here, and I run it. So from our perspective, I can actually run it within Certify and I can see it, but that's not my end goal. In reality, what I want to do is I want to actually be concerned with the report. I I don't really care how it runs or the fact that it runs. What I'm concerned with is what's the result of that run. So we can actually get different types of reports out of the system. It could be, this is a basic audit compliancy document that shows the system ran and this was the result. Maybe it's a detailed report where we start getting screenshots and showing what happened along the way. Now notice this is pretty interesting. You'll notice there's a bunch of asterisks on the screen. It may be a little small, but you should be able to tell that sensitive data like passwords, we automatically figured out how to star out. So even though you have screenshots and documentation, we've respected that. We haven't shown you sensitive data there. Other times it's actually very much like detailed reports. I see each element of data that goes into the page and if it passed or failed. So the idea is we need to actually consider that we're running the automation and the output we're interested in is actually the audit reports. It's those Sarbanes-Oxley reports that say, yes, not only do we run it, but we ran the test. Now the great thing that happens when you apply automation, and it doesn't matter if it's data-driven or having a single test for everything, the nice thing is the computer software tends to do the same things the same way every time. So there's no human judgment inside of there. So when you give an auditor these type of reports and say, the test automation ran and this was the result, they'll know there was no human judgment in there. So we know that we didn't like kind of take advantage and do something mentally different. We actually know it was consistently run the same time every time. So our audit reports are highly trusted. And so auditors love to hear that, yes, I've got automated testing, here's my detailed report on that, and we validated the system over and over and over again. So back when I started with Worksoft this last summer, we had our user conference, Ignite 2016. So one thing we did is we actually talked to a lot of our customers and asked them, you know, what do you do when you get your time back with automation? What are you doing next? Because these people, it's like, they're basically drinking the Kool-Aid. They're starting to do automation of these manual tests. So we asked them, what are you doing now that you've implemented automation? Well, this first set of activities, by feedback I found, I grouped them. I thought they were kind of interesting. They said they focus on new requirements and the next iteration. Or we're getting ready to start multiple projects in different areas of the country with the time we saved. Okay, it helps me support unplanned and parallel projects. Okay, who can say they haven't had an unplanned or parallel project request this week, right? It's part of our life with multitasking, right? And finally, time. You can focus on the areas that really require attention. So what we found talking to some customers, it wasn't the time they got back, it was the fact they could do other things with that time. They really were talking about how do we actually support new projects and work this in parallel. So really what they're focusing on is, I'm not spending time manual testing, but I'm doing better things for the business. I'm actually getting more done. I'm thinking, you know, more efficient, think smarter, not harder type thing, right? So we asked a whole bunch of customers this, and another group of customers, this was kind of a common feedback. We're really saving our functional analyst time by using automation instead of manual testing, okay? So they're able to spend time on supporting projects. So, hey, kind of sounds like our webinar. We actually saved functional analyst time. Love that quote, right? Okay, we're going ahead and giving manual testers the ability to test new systems. So already on the next release while we're regressing the previous release. So that's time back on our users for our testers, right? So by doing automation, they're getting time back to the testers so they can focus on new things versus that boring, droning, let me manually validate the system over and over again. Okay? And now that we don't have as many people manually testing like we used to day after day, we can spend more time focused on business directives. So the great thing about automated testing, they're getting time back and they're focusing on the business. What can we do to be more successful and get our competitive advantage? And the last quote, it's a little bit long, but it's actually really valuable. There are several activities our team members engage for doing regression testing. It requires a lot of laborious work. We're able to automate that and give time back to them so they can focus on more intelligent testing. Okay, how awesome is that? So when I talked to this group of customers, they all said the key thing they talked about was getting time back. Hence the name of our webinar. It's kind of like that aha moment. Maybe I should do a webinar on taking your weekends back and getting the time. So what does this mean? If you're saving time for people, they have more time to spend on other things, or they can just get the time back. So if you want to see what the real customers are talking about, if you go to our website, www.worksoft.com/videos, you'll see all these quotes came directly from real users. So this wasn't something marketing made up and I said, yes, I agree to that. This was real users who are using our software to get high levels of automation and run those tests and how they're getting their time back. So it's pretty impressive. So go look to real users and figure out how you can do what they're doing. So the next thing I want to talk about is actually how do you handle this. So if you're working and you're building your automation suite, you don't want to actually have to go do those, run those tests yourself, right? So let's talk about how can we let the software work the nights and weekends and do that work for us, okay? The great thing about the computer, it doesn't matter what time of day or day of week, it's going to get paid the same thing, very little, right? So what we want to do is we actually want to build regression suites to validate that end-to-end system. So it doesn't matter if you span mobile devices to SOA services, to SAP, to Concur, to Hybris, to the mainframe. Build that beautiful, huge suite for regression end-to-end business process. And then schedule with the computer to run that on the nights and the weekends, like when there's free time, right? And then you can actually execute them locally or in the cloud. So that means you could actually run them in your own data center because you want to understand your customer experience for your service reps, or maybe you need to run this in the cloud. So that means you use like hardware or virtual machines, say Amazon or Azure, what have you, that's out there that are connecting into the systems the same way your real users do. Okay. The nice thing with Execution Manager, when we do the scheduling, we can add intelligence to the schedule. We can say, run this daily, hourly, weekly, right? Things like that. We can actually kick these off from our continuous integration and continuous build servers. So, traditional testing says we run our weekly tests, we run our daily tests. But with Agile changing the way we're thinking about delivering to our customers, a lot of people say, we test based on events. There's a new build, we have a new transport in SAP, we're going to push that out. There's an event in the continuous delivery. So we use the Jenkins plugin or the REST calls to actually go kick off, certify our Execution Manager to run them as part of the build process. You'll hear people talk about that all the time, and we fully support that. Do what makes sense for you. The great thing about Execution Manager is when you run your tests, you can run them based on the outcome of a previous test. So you don't just run them and hope for the best. What we want to do is actually run them, and we can say the next test only runs if the first one passes, or maybe you schedule 100 tests run in parallel on Amazon, and then if those pass, run your next wave of tests. Because we don't want to get a bunch of false failures out there by running 10,000 tests. What we want to do is run tests in waves and actually run them as parallel as possible so that they run as fast as possible. The great thing about running tests in parallel with computer software is you save a lot of wall clock, right? You're actually saving the amount of time so you can actually run a full regression overnight or on a weekend. Now, the best part is when you let the computer, or say Execution Manager, run those tests for you on a nightly basis or on the weekend, what you're worried about is getting those reports delivered. So things we looked about earlier, the Sarbanes-Oxley reports, your business process procedures, all those things. Those are the outcomes you're interested in seeing and how they work. So does this really exist out there? Is anybody really doing this? Well, of course they are. So I'll give you a couple case studies of people using Execution Manager to run the really large regression suites on a very regular basis. So here I have a federal agency. So let's face it, everything the federal government does is at huge scale. They do nothing small, right? So this year's federal program has more than 10 million participants. So these are people who log into the website and work with their systems on a daily basis. And what this web application has to do is integrate with 30 external systems. So there's a lot of integration there and a lot of users. So you think making sure this works really well is important. There's a lot of digital risk that they need. They can't have technical failures. They've got 10,000 users. It's complex. There's 30 backend systems out there. So what they were looking at is how do we ensure that this works well? So the problem is they said we need a lot of manual testers to do this, but there's no way we're going to test all these workflows and all these business processes every day for high reliability. And so what they did is they looked at how do we solve this problem. So they came to Worksoft and said, let's talk about automation. So they actually have 500,000, 500,000 business process steps, and they run them every night within a 2 to 3 hour window. So they literally say, I need to regress my system every day because it's so important for those millions of users who log in. And I'm going to like spin out into Amazon a whole bunch of servers. You're going to start running my tests and certifying, taking my business processes through the systems, and I'm going to validate them. So this is huge risk mitigation for them. Program-wide, that means their automation is covering over 400 core processes in their daily testing. So if you think about it, you're having to send data to, say, 30 different states and different agencies and that, you need to make sure that you test all those things. Having 400 core business processes really isn't a lot. I mean, there's only a handful for every state, right? Okay. The good thing is the outcome is the quality. Super high quality, experience, customer experience is guaranteed. They virtually eliminated any risk of production failures because they've actually done a really good job of doing this. Now, the interesting thing is, what did they do? 200,000 hours of manual labor replaced by digital labor. So this doesn't mean that they actually got rid of a bunch of people. What this means is those people who are coming in on the weekends and actually testing, people doing things late at night and testing, because they drew the short straw because they had to test over the weekend, right? Or they're waiting for a system to be validated. Those people actually could do something more interesting, like go home, see their family, right? So the whole point of getting your weekend back is how can we take that manual labor, automate it, and then do other things like work on the new project in parallel, things like that. Think about those different things I talked about that our customers are actually doing. Here's another customer. This one happens to be a heavy SAP user, and so they're actually featured in the SAP journal. This is a luxury goods manufacturer. They have 8.8 billion euros in luxury goods they sell a year. So they have lots of brands that you would know out there. They're very SAP-centric for their workflows. They have the SAP GUI, they have the SAP websites, but then they have to integrate with all their other applications. So think about, from a retailer's perspective, it's not just the manufacturing and the supply chain, it's the point of sales to get ring things up in the stores. It's the human resources, for timesheets and all that. This is huge, the number of things they have to do, right? So they realized for them to keep up with their applications working, they actually had to do a lot of updates because retail is a very competitive industry, right? So they need to make sure that they were responsive from an IT perspective to what the business needs. There's nothing more sensitive than fashion to changes, right? So what was their digital risk? Well, they basically said they had 1,700 plus retail shops. So technically, they're always open. It doesn't matter if it's Christmas in the U.S., because with time zones, they could be in Asia and they're open the day after Christmas. If you think about it, it doesn't matter how many holidays there are. Someone with 1,700 global retail stores is always open. It's in every airport, right? So they need to figure out how to keep high levels of their applications or service level agreements. Risk is really unacceptable for them. So when they looked at testing this, they realized that high operational costs and limited available resources with manual testing means they would have to delay delivery of their software because they made a conscious decision that quality was the #1 thing for them, so they did not want to release untested software, which we all know we kind of do on the side, but they just couldn't do that. Their brand was too important. So they were introduced to Worksoft, and they started applying Certify. So what happened is they started validating their end-to-end business process with Worksoft Certify. They basically have 600 hours of daily tests that run on about 120 virtual machines every day. So think about that. 600 hours, that doesn't work. That means they're running a lot of tests in parallel. 120 machines to run 600 hours, they're running their tests in parallel. Great thing about computers, we can do that, right? And then enterprise-wide, they've got 80% of their core business processes, those 500 business processes, tested every day. So don't you know, from a risk management standpoint, that's mitigating a lot of fears about having a problem in the store or not being able to get timesheets and people and supply chain and all those things organized well. So from a quality perspective, they really had a significant reduction in production defects. And it's literally just because they're doing more testing. I dare you to find anybody in the world who says, hey, we did more testing and didn't find any defects. Of course you do. Everybody says the more testing they do, the more defects they find. So the interesting thing is that digital labor. We come back to taking your weekends back, right? 55,000 hours of manual labor annually replaced by digital labor. So don't you think that the people will be doing manual testing on the weekends are breathing a sigh of relief that they're not working the weekends, and they're worrying about other projects? So if you're business analyst and a business user, you've got your weekend back. But if you're actually a QA person, we talk about all those different things you work in parallel. How can I actually do the next initiative so I am actually more successful as a company? How can I bring out the next product line or innovation so that we can be in the top of the category? So to come back to the beginning, so how are you spending your weekends, right? We kind of talked about that. Did you draw the short straw and you're waiting for 3 a.m. like this lady who'd rather be at the beach, obviously, because that's who she's looking at? Are you sitting in the dark room by yourself because you're actually doing your manual testing? Or are you trying to make it more fun and say, okay, even though I'm testing on the weekend and the family's on vacation, I'm going to sit here and do what I need to do to validate the system, hopefully quickly, and I'll just have a little wine while I do it. Or you're trying to figure out is there enough desserts out there to make this more fun. So instead of sitting there and doing your manual testing, waiting for the test to start because the systems have to be configured and ready, waiting for fixes to be applied. So are we not getting to one round of tests and then we have to wait to redo it because there was a defect, or ever popular, God knows I've done this more than once. Are you actually arguing with your developers about functionality? At a certain point when you're doing a test and you fail it, there's times when developers will say, working as designed, the business user says, no, that's not how it's supposed to work. How do we actually do this? How do we negotiate that? This is not what I'm needed to do for the business itself, arguing with the developers on functionality. At the end, it doesn't matter what beverage we've added and how much we've added. It's just not having fun. So we need to think about how do we actually do more validation of systems automatically to do this. So our suggestion is actually applying those 3 things. Let's go discover what we need to test. We can actually use our technologies to capture what you're doing or what your end users are doing, turn those into testing assets. But the trick is those automated tests want to be scheduled and run every day so that the computer is working the nights and the weekends versus you. So to actually take your weekends back, we need to think about how do we apply automation and smarter technology to do that so that we actually get better results and higher quality. There's case studies that talk about it. We have the user videos on worksoft.com/videos where people talk about the value. So if you do that, what are you actually going to do? What could you do to get when you get your weekends back? Well, of course, this is the best part of the webinar, right? So obviously, you could go to the beach. So instead of sitting there and saying, oh, I wish I was at the beach, I'm looking at people at the beach, you can actually go there, right? If you're not a sand person, ride your bike on the beach. Get outside, get some sun. Or instead of sitting in a dark room waiting for the test to start, go to a concert, get outside in the dark. Or actually go dance in the dark. No one's watching, it's the dark, right? So go do something fun, okay? Or instead of sitting in with your computer and a glass of wine, go to a wine tasting class. Get out there and meet other people and do something different. There is life after work, people tell me. Or have your morning cup of coffee outside. Instead of worrying about that 3 a.m. call, we're ready to test, just set your alarm a little bit early and go on a hike and get outside and actually have your morning coffee. So I'll leave it to you to set up, to fill in the blanks of what you want to do with your time back. But the most important thing is thinking about how can I actually accomplish that. Setting a goal to actually say, I want to start automating my testing and have the computer do that work so I don't have to worry about my Sarbanes-Oxley audits, my compliancy documents, or actually validating that end-to-end business process, letting the computer do the work for me. So at this point, we'll go over to the Q&A, and we'll see what's happening.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to everyone for attending. If we weren't able to get to your question, we will be in touch with more information. And as mentioned earlier, we will be sending you a link to a recording of the webinar. And if you're interested in learning more about Worksoft, please visit our website. Thank you for your time today. This concludes the webinar. Have a great day.